And we have John DiMoia, who is an assistant professor in history, who teaches on the history of modern Korea, as well as a broader history of science, technology, and medicine. Now, earlier we heard Lawrence talking about Stanford University and research in Stanford University on FM waves and how that became the biggest money earner. And actually, just to think of relationships between talks, John will be saying something about the creative milieu of Stanford University and how that understanding and ideas on creativity has filtered across the Pacific to Korea and Singapore. And today his talk is about attracting minds and assets, examining scientific creativity in Singapore. John.
Good afternoon. I think I'll begin with an anecdote that actually happens frequently on a daily basis to my research group leader, Greg Clancy, whom many of you know. Now that the STS group is based over at Tembusu College, Greg can see a great deal of the current University Town site out of his apartment window. And he said that he finds this both pleasing and disturbing, and it's the disturbing part that I'll try to emphasize. When he wakes up every morning, he now wakes up to the create and innovate signs, basically looking out of his window. And he said his response, and I'm paraphrasing here, so I can't quote directly, but his response is something along the lines of 7 o'clock in the morning, just waking up, and his response is, who, me? I'm supposed to be creating and innovating? And then, of course, his second response, and of course I mean this both seriously and humorously, is, how am I supposed to be innovating at 7 o'clock in the morning? And he feels vaguely kind of guilty. I want to use this anecdote as a way of starting my talk in the sense that I am essentially trying to look at, historically, using Stanford as my model, and then briefly at the end of the talk, coming to other sites, both in South Korea and in Singapore, how people have looked at the conditions for scientific creativity, what types of environments or milieu are useful and conducive to producing large amounts of scientific activity, and particularly productive things that turn into real-world applications. This Stanford story has been told very famously, so I'm giving a very sort of capsule version of it, but I'll start with Louis Terman. Terman is very much a very famous psychologist at Stanford at the turn of the 20th century, and particularly he's associated with the creation of the Stanford Binet intelligence test that is taking the existing French system and quantifying it the American way. But more specifically for my purposes, he is famous for starting a longitudinal study beginning in 1921 of about 1,000 children. This study will continue well into the 1980s, and I believe some of them are still alive, perhaps someone else is conducting the study. And this is frequently known as the Termite Study. The children who were studied were known as the termites. History does not record how they felt about being known as the termites. But more importantly, Terman was interested in the early 1920s notion of that intelligent children were kind of sickly, would be kind of social outcasts, would be a little bit different, would not be likely to be productive adults. And he very much did not believe this. So he was interested in looking at them longitudinally, identifying them through his testing methods, and then tracking to see whether or not they would become well-functioning, productive adults in the long run. This is one of the termites. He's not a particularly famous individual. This is Russell Silo. But I just wanted to show you the picture to show that he is a happy, kind of smiling adult figure, and the Terman was very successful in kind of coming up with the results that over the long term, these people were no different than other ordinary people in terms of their social functioning, in terms of their ability to live as happy human beings. The more important thing for the termite story is, and particularly for the Terman story in terms of Stanford, is that it represents one pole of an artificial binary that I want to set up. That is, Terman was very much about, you're going to have to identify specific people through testing, get a bunch of highly intelligent people, that's the way to go if you want to produce kind of a productive community. Lots of people have criticized the strengths and the limitations of Terman's methods, his approach, his sample size, so I won't go into that. But I do want to emphasize that very famously, and specifically exceptions indicating problems with Terman's method, are some of the children he tested did go on to be very famous, specifically exceeding what he had. They were children who were not identified as being smart enough to be part of his group, and then they ended up winning the Nobel Prize, thereby challenging very much his results. Two of them are Luis Alvarez, who I'm guessing is a little bit less famous. William Shockley, certainly to me and other historians of science, is extremely famous as the man who's associated with the transistor. Shockley was in one of the schools in California. He apparently was not smart enough to make Termin's group, but he won the Nobel Prize. And I believe to this day, no one who was actually in the original Termin group, despite the fact that many bright people came out of it, ever won the Nobel Prize. So Shockley is often mobilized as kind of one of the limitations to Termin's method. Okay, that's the first poll I want to come up with. How do we then move forward to Stanford becoming a much more interesting place by mid-20th century in the United States? And this is what is frequently mobilized, and yes, it is the same Termin family. This is Frederick Termin, Dean of Engineering, Provost, I can't tell you the exact years, but basically Fred Termin's kind of period of productivity is associated with the 1950s at Stanford, which is why, interestingly, Lance's story I found very interesting in the 70s, and particularly the idea of that being the most profitable, because the story that's more famous to historians of science is the one I'm going to tell about transistors, but nonetheless, that's something I'll definitely have to look into. Fred Termin, though, in contrast to this idea of focusing only on individuals, their IQs, and just getting bright people, was very much about fostering relationships between the university and the community. And this is where we get the beginnings of the origins of things like Silicon Valley, a huge cross-culture between business and intersecting with the university. Now, of course, Termin doesn't get sole credit for this. It's not like Stanford was totally isolated before the two Termins. This is 367 Addison Avenue, and according to the source where I took this from, one of the reasons this picture is not direct, this is the garage where Hewlett-Packard actually started itself, and it's now still a private residence, so you can't go right in. So I found this on a website where the writer of the blog was very apologetic about not getting a better picture because basically he didn't want to invade the private space of the homeowner. But this is just to give you an idea that Stanford was already starting on a small scale to get this people graduating from the university, starting to foster growth in the surrounding area. But Termin will really put it to use by the 50s and 60s by getting all kinds of federal grants, by encouraging graduates to begin starting companies in the surrounding area. This kind of thing will really help Stanford become the institution that it does. And these are just a couple of the quick examples. Shockley and the transistor in the mid-1950s being one of the most famous examples. Fairchild Semiconductor Company, which is a spin-off of Shockley's group. Interestingly, the anecdote I want to throw in here is the Fairchild group is mostly people who were recruited by Shockley and worked with Shockley. Shockley not only was not smart enough to make the Termin group, but he also apparently was not the most friendly human being, and basically everyone in Fairchild broke away from Shockley and made a lot of money, and Shockley was left out of the group. So just because you're intelligent doesn't mean you're a great manager. The Stanford Research Institute from 1946, a research institute affiliated with the university, but nonetheless sort of unofficially, not officially part of the university, where spin-offs can come from, also helping to foster this culture. So this creating conditions for researchers, creating conditions for ideas that are not even immediately applicable in terms of commercial use until much later. The gentleman on the left, Douglas Engelbart, may be famous to some people in CNN, I'm not sure, but to others he's probably best known to historians of science as the inventor of the computer mouse. That is a mouse that Engelbart has with himself. And the early mouse, as I teach my students, actually has a history. It's really traceable to about the early to mid-1960s. And Engelbart does a famous demo video that you can still find on the net today in 1968, where he cuts and pastes text using a mouse. Now to us this is nothing revolutionary, and my students always kind of say, yeah, so what? But in 1968 this was an extremely radical idea, and he was showing essentially what word processing, what the next generation of computers would be like 10 to 15 years in the future. So I give you that this kind of culture exists at Stanford by about the 1950s, the 1960s, and these are just some of my examples. Bill Leslie, Rebecca Lowen, lots of other historians have written about this and called this the Cold War University, and that comes to the other point I want to make. If I can reframe before I move on, if we've got sort of the idea of the brains and the minds that have to be out there, this is the father Termin, Louis Termin's idea. Fred Termin's idea being more about the community and being conducive and creating an environment. Obviously, we can't neglect money. And that's the idea that the US doesn't really take off as a global scientific power until around the time of World War II and after, partly to do with migration of European scientists, especially German scientists, but but especially the role of the federal research economy. Lots of money being poured in specifically because of the war, as you can see the spike, and then that little download between 45 and 50, and then picking up again with the Korean War. So let's not forget about the money. The money has to be there, and in many ways, much of the money that Fred Terman channels to his students, associates, graduate students at Stanford in the 50s is often for defense-related projects, and the technologies that spin off of that are not what the federal government imagined. It happens to be that lots of money sometimes produces ideas that are usable in a very different way. Okay, so I'm making a shift here, and I just want to explain exactly why I'm doing this shift. If we've got those three factors out there already, you need smart people, you need a certain amount of money, you need a conducive environment. When South Korea starts to really look to, we're starting to develop our economy. Park Chung-hee has been in office now 5 years. This is 1966. They put together something called KIST, the Korea Institute of Science and Technology, and this is a present-day image of the campus. And they start looking around for models. And the model that they look to, among others, is particularly the Stanford model, because they look at this and they say, wow, this place really seems to be taking off. They're presumably looking at a lot of the computer technology and things that are coming out. They say, we really want to kind of do this kind of thing. The problem that KIST and the Koreans will find out is that just replicating it, and I believe one of the speakers in the first panel said this, it's not a formula, it can't just be reduced. The Koreans will ultimately, in the long run, achieve a good deal of success. But in the short run, they find out that just making the model, and particularly building a Stanford in South Korea, is not quite nearly as easy as they think it might be. Before I talk a little bit about those factors, just kind of a publicity shot. This is Park Chung-hee striding boldly into the future. I guess this is just prior to the groundbreaking ceremony in 1969. Mrs. Park back there in the hanbok. And the gentleman kind of explaining something, moving his hands around. Che Young-sub, who is basically Park Chung-hee's science guy, not a lot has been written about him in English, and in fact, somebody, not me, needs to write about a good 500-page biography of him. But he's essentially the big guy, the man behind the man, who's running a lot of KIST and other big, huge Korean scientific projects. Okay, to that question, I've already hinted at the connection with Stanford. The Koreans mobilize it as a model. Why do they mobilize it as a model? One, they see a huge overlap that KIST, the idea is that KIST will be near other scientific institutions in Seoul, and that there should be, like Stanford Research Institute, a fusion between the universities and KIST, promoting some sort of synergistic effect, or at least they think so. KIST wants to follow a contract research system. That is, KIST, at least as an inception, is very much about industry, about doing short-term contracts based on a time clock, not blue sky academic research. Later they will change this. And the idea is they will improve something that industry needs, meet the problem, solve the problem, contract is finished, move on to the next one. And of course, implicitly or explicitly as well, and this is not a problem Stanford faced, but Korea definitely did at this time, KIST is created to solve the problem of brain drain. Korea at this time, especially post-65, they're eligible to emigrate to the United States. Lots of people moving to the US, getting PhDs, getting MDs, and then not coming home. KIST is about getting these people to come back home, we'll pay you a higher salary, we'll give you US-style facilities, and you will build a community here, ultimately comparable to that in the US. Before I talk about Singapore then, I did hint that there are some problems with the KIST model. And in a nutshell, given the interest of time, I'll just say this. What they find particularly to be a problem in KIST for the first 10 to 15 years is there basically is not a local industry in Korea capable of using the high-level abilities that KIST has. Many of you today probably have the image of something like Samsung or other Korean brand names in mind. Please keep in mind that as of about 1970, South Korea's primary exports are things like wigs, processed plywood, basically light manufacturing, handmade things. South Korea doesn't really start making Samsung TVs and things like that until very recently, and they don't have their own internal R&D facilities in a company like Samsung until at least the early to mid 1980s. So this is just to give you an idea of the difficulties of transferring that Stanford culture to another site like South Korea, which then brings me to Singapore. Now I have to be honest, I've only been here 3.5 years. I'm a historian. I don't know a lot about the Singapore case. So in many ways, what I'm going to talk about in this last several slides is by way of analogy, things I've identified as historical tensions in other sites, and just asked it more as questions applicable to the Singapore scene. Obviously, the Biopolis shot here is just partly in the sense that as part of the research group, and somebody had mentioned it earlier, the Lance, the Asian Bioplace project, which Greg Clancy leads, I'm part of it. So I'm very interested in looking at a place like this. But what are some of these issues that are relevant to Singapore? And not only Singapore, but of course, things like Japan and its Scuba Science City, Taiwan and Hsinchu Science Park, and India in places like the IITs has already been through these issues earlier as well. I think there are lots of interesting tensions in the Singapore model, and I said I throw these out more as problematics that I think Singapore is wrestling with, but hopefully in a good way. In particular, I think, and I see this in my students every day, again, so these are just more superficial observations, but things like a curriculum that is very much about asking students to memorize and learn, certainly when they go through O and A levels, and yet they come to us and we try to promote creativity, flexibility, and in an interesting way, and by no means as a professor do I want to encourage failure, but I find it interesting that many of my students have never failed in a structured situation, and in a weird way in my classes I sometimes try to give them opportunities to fail, in the sense that if you learn to fail, I mean this is what science is all about, you learn then to maneuver off of that and move forward. So this is one kind of thing. I guess another thing I want to say in terms of attention is the need, and this is why I brought out that analogy of the innovate and create science and Greg's tension, the need to promote applications, short-term projects, in scientific and creative fields where that's not necessarily bound to a clock, where you aren't necessarily structured that way and you can't always predict what will happen. The famous example I give here, of course, is Google, which famously allows its employees to basically devote one full day of a standard work week to a project of their own kind of interest. And Google has found, quite interestingly, that many of these projects turn into things that the company can then mobilize. So I would call this even something along the lines of opportunities for play, or certainly opportunities for creative play, structured within a larger situation. So if I can wrap up here and try to bring together a little bit of the Stanford information along with the South Korean example, and then again, as I said, trying to talk about it in terms of Singapore and at least in terms of problematics or tensions, as I suggested earlier. There are always going to be tensions, particularly going back to my Termin examples, between identifying very smart people and getting them to produce. And as we saw, Termin Lewis, that is, in particular, failed very conspicuously in missing William Shockley as part of his target group. There are always, especially, going to be tensions over borders. And by borders, I mean public and private, that is, corporate research versus sort of academic blue sky research, practicality versus blue sky, and especially between national or transnational research communities. This is something that I always see in Korea because for a long time, Korean universities and research parks were only Korean. Increasingly today, much less so than Singapore, Koreans have realized they need to bring in lots of people from the region and have started to diversify that. So recognizing that science, because it's transnational, sometimes needs to be far more diverse. And I guess last but not least, and this is a good way of kind of ending with a nice kind of some failure examples that I know and are near and dear to my heart. Maybe failure is the wrong word. That translating the Stanford model into a working definition is just simply not an easy thing. So it can't be reduced to a simple formula, and I think that's the take-home point. It's about fostering conditions in an environment, but you can't always predict exactly how and why those things will work, besides the minds, besides the money, besides the conditions. So two last examples. MIT and Route 128, which is outside of MIT in Boston, many people in the American context love to compare why has MIT and Route 128 been a little bit successful, but why is Silicon Valley the first thing out of everyone's lips when they talk about things like that? And people are they know MIT, but they don't know Route 128. Only a few Americans do, number one. And my home city, Philadelphia, where I grew up, University of Pennsylvania, wonderful university, has the Wharton School. You would think this is absolutely ideal for fostering activity. Drexel University is less than 8 to 10 city blocks down the road, highly known, good engineering technical school. They have tried for years, at least since I've been alive, to create a fusion between the two of them, calling the entire area University City. Penn now has certain buildings in the area where it actually rents out office space to recent graduates to get them to do startup companies. This has been, I wouldn't call it a conspicuous failure, but it's been very quiet. I'm assuming that no one in this audience has ever heard about any spin-off companies popping up in Philadelphia. This has a lot to do with geography, the location between New York and Washington, D.C., the fact that Stanford and Silicon Valley are already there and are far more appealing places to live in Philadelphia, I can tell you. It's why I'm here. So it can't be reduced to a simple formula. I think I'll leave that as my take-home point. And again, this is just one quick way of looking at how the Stanford model has migrated across the world in different ways, in different cultures. Thank you.